right. So I have a couple of videos for you to watch, and they have to do with, part of this chapter talks about forces that are called compression and tension. Did you remember reading about that? Did we talk about cantilevers yet? Okay, all right, I'll have to make sure I do that. So I guess I'll show you three videos. Cantilevers are one thing, and then we have this other thing. Normally when humans were going to build buildings, they would build like walls, and then they put a roof on it. Many times a roof would be lighter material, it might be wood or leaves and stuff like that. So it wasn't a big problem there unless it like snowed or something like that. And then the weight of it would collapse into the building. But then also in history, humans wanted to build buildings that maybe were bigger. Even a lot of our churches that they started building, they wanted the church to be bigger. Lots of buildings were builder. So how do you build things bigger when you have all this weight? And you have this weight of things, and you put these two columns like this. What if you put a piece of stone like that? Well, that might be all right if it only spans this far. But what if the stone has to go this far? You got your two columns. Is it okay? Let's go a little further. Let's go a little further. So what happens if you keep putting a stone thing on the top, a roof on the top? What happens? It's going to collapse. And why? And we're going to talk about that. And then also, how did we learn how to build buildings that were taller, really tall? And how could the weight of the building not crush itself? And so the first ones I'm going to show you then had to do with arches. Have you ever thought about that? How arches work? So I want to have you watch that a little quickly. Then I'll show you about cantilevers, and then we'll get into, I'll show you some pictures in the book and that kind of thing there. Okay, can you flip off that first light switch for me, please? All right, how are you going to build something big and not have it collapse? Has everybody read Moses chapter yet? Have you ever read about compression and tension?
Sure.
Okay, all right. So let me go ahead and start this thing. All right, so we may end up seeing three today because you hadn't seen nothing.
This way of constructing buildings, pioneered by the Greeks, the Parthenon on the hill named the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, was a monumental structure intended to be the home in here of a statue of a deity. And actually the statue was taken to be the deity. But this also was not a general purpose type of a structure, something that might be used for various purposes. It had a very special purpose. Let's take a look at what the Greeks learned about constructing a temple. They had to know how to measure and how to use geometry, and how to cut stone accurately, and how to plan, certainly, and to construct and to organize labor. To do all of this, and the area being very large, 100 feet by 228 feet. So this really is quite an undertaking to have been accomplished almost 500 years before Christ with the technology that was then available. Here, let's take a look at one member of this structure, and that is a support here and a support here by a column, and then this spanning member. On one end, that spanning member rests on a column. On the other end, it rests on a column. But this is a heavy piece of stone, and gravity pulls it downward. Now, it turns out that when something solid like this is supported in this way, the force acting down on it tends to stretch the lower surface. And that stretching is definitely a force, it's in tension. Up here, because of the way the force is acting, the stone is actually being compressed. Stone is strong and can resist against compression, but it's brittle and can't resist stretching. So you do this separating these pillars too much, and this is exactly what happens. The stone is going to fracture and break. And we suspect the Greeks figured that out by trial and error. And so the distance between here and here is probably no more than, 10 feet at the most, maybe 6 feet in between this point here and this point here. Anything longer than that, and the stone, no matter how big you make it, is probably going to fracture and break. Now, in modern construction, architects do this same thing and span great distances using concrete, which is very much like stone, except you pour it in a fluid state and then it sets up chemically to become stone. And in order to do this in modern construction, a piece of reinforcing steel here is inserted, and this becomes pre-stressed concrete. Steel can take stretching, and it makes up for the weakness of concrete in that way. So now, with this sort of a member, quite a large distance can be spanned, and you'll see this in parking structures quite commonly. The supports for the concrete members are very widely spaced, and what you don't see is that there are cables or rods running the whole length to counteract the tension that exists by the downward pressure. Well, the Greeks didn't have this. They didn't have the ability to create steel in that quantity and to use it in this way, and they probably didn't quite understand the physics involved. How are you going to span larger distances then using only stone? Well, it turns out the Sumerians figured this much out, that you could use an arch. And this distance here is much larger than the limit that you could accomplish in spanning with just a member across here. Let's see how the arch works to do this. Although the Sumerians invented it, the Greeks really didn't use it much, and the Romans perfected it and used it a tremendous amount in all their civil engineering projects, such as this aqueduct. Here's what happens with an arch.
It's called a Roman arch.
It's constructed of separate stones. These are all separate stones, wedge-shaped. And when this is constructed, there's a support down here called falsework. And it's actually a lot of wood that probably looks like it's something like this. And it's constructed to be a temporary support for the stones to be placed on there. So the stones are placed like this, building up, and after all these stones are in place resting on this falsework, then the keystone is inserted, and you'll notice it's kind of trapezoidal shaped. And what happens here is it tries to move down, and by moving down, this sloping side here pushes on these stones here, and stone can take compression very well. So here's what happens. Weight comes down this way, and the force goes down like this.
I'll stop you just for a minute. It's not just the weight of the arch. What they're going to do is build on top of the arch, and it's going to be really heavy. So the weight of everything above that arch is also going to do the same thing.
These stones can take this compressive force. Ultimately, the force is directed outward and downward, and then the falsework can be removed. The stones are usually cemented in place, but they need not be. This whole structure would work, assuming, of course, that all this area was also filled with stone. If this were just sitting here, then it may be that things become a little bit unstable unless this area is also resisting any outward pressure. But this is exactly how an arch works. The keystone has to be sloped in this way in order for this to happen. And there has to be mass here to resist this outward pressure. Here's what the Romans did. They repeated the arch, and you can see that the force coming down this way is resisted by the force this way repeatedly. So in constructing these, they would have perhaps 2 or 3 sets of falsework, and they would move the falsework along to build the aqueduct. In fact, in here, they built this one first, and then they built this one and the little one on top. And this was very carefully constructed so that water could flow in a channel here. Other constructions the Romans created that we'll see in just a few seconds also used the arch. And sometimes they even use the arch in a commemorative way, simply to have a surface to put commemorative inscriptions on. The arch has come down to us as a traditional architectural element. This building was constructed in 1880, and it sits in the Chicago downtown area, right opposite the Daily Center. And you'll notice here arches and kind of an exaggerated keystone. When we look at buildings like this, it's sometimes kind of curious whether the arch is really functioning as an arch or if it's only just a decorative element. It's kind of a giveaway here that the architects who designed this building actually had the technology to span this distance using just a straight member. They didn't have to use an arch because right here is a window the same width with a flat spanning member. Here it's fairly clear that this is being used probably as a cosmetic element. And you'll notice also, hiding behind this number 8, and over here, and around many windows, are columns, which are also just decorative elements. So here we have features of ancient architecture creeping forward into more modern architecture, mainly because they were so popular in terms of the way that the arch and columns were used, that people came to expect buildings to have these kinds of features. And here you see a different type of an arch located up on Fullerton, an apartment house. This also is an arch, but you'll notice it's a little different. It's pointed. We're going to talk about this when we talk about the Gothic era. Architects in the Gothic era found an advantage to making an arch function in this way. Here, the keystone still has a trapezoidal shape, but it's also got this point to it that kind of covers up the fact that how it's acting as a force downward here to direct this way and this way. That's exactly what the top of a pointed arch does. So the keystone here has a different shape. And here's an arch that probably is really functioning as an arch. This is on an older house constructed about 1935 or earlier in Lincoln Park, down the street from our Lincoln Park campus. And the arch that you see here probably really is functioning as an arch. This stone is fairly heavy, and you'll see glass couldn't possibly support this stone. These walls really are load-bearing walls, and this arch is functioning as an arch to make it possible to have this area here have no support at all. That is, it doesn't support anything above.
Yeah, this is it.
Arches
One
allow
more.
people to build bigger, span farther, and reach higher than ever before. But they also represent nearly a dozen different architectural styles.
Hidden in the brickwork are clues you can spot, telling you who was here without ever needing to read a plaque.
Here are the 6 most common types of arches that you'll find in your travels, and what they tell you.
First, let's start with the predecessor of the arch, the post and lintel. Picture Stonehenge, the Parthenon, or just a regular doorway. Ever since Neolithic times, people have been placing a long block, called a lintel, across 2 supports. Lintels cannot hold much weight, so the posts have to be either very wide or very close together. As a rule of thumb, the farther a civilization can span a roof without supports, the more architecturally sophisticated they are. By the way, post and lintel arches are not arches, so forget them.
After the post and lintel came the corbelled arch, also known as a fosse arch. A single corbel is a type of support where each layer of rocks inches farther and farther out from a wall. If you place 2 opposite each other, you can span a divide. Corbelled arches are old, dating back at least to ancient Egypt, but they're not very strong. Just like a bridge made with stacked quarters, they need extra weight for gravity to counteract the forces. Take the extra weight away, and the corbelled arch collapses.
The rounded arch fixed these issues by placing wedged bricks in a semicircle, channeling forces around the arch rather than through the middle. The Romans didn't technically invent the arch, I'm looking at you, Ishtargate, but they did master it. Along with the invention of concrete, it allowed for much taller, wider, and loftier construction. Romans strung them in a row to make arcades, stretched them down the hall into vaults, and spun them around to create domes.
The Roman arch revolutionized architecture and quickly spread throughout the empire and beyond. But it wasn't perfect. Roman arches exert pressure downward, so in order to support larger buildings, they need very thick walls at the base. This means small, deep-set windows which don't let in much light. Roman-style churches are therefore much darker and shorter than their Gothic-style counterparts.
Speaking of Gothic, let's get to the point. The pointed arch was invented around the 7th century CE in the Islamic Empire. However, after the Crusaders brought the knowledge back west, it became the signature style of the Gothic High Middle Ages around 1200 CE. Instead of having one circle making the curve, it uses the intersection of 2 larger circles, like the inner part of a Venn diagram. Pedantic footnote: if the arch's span and radius of the circle's curve are equal, it's a Gothic arch. If the span is less than the radius, it's a lancet arch. And if it's more, it's a depressed arch.
Extra supports called buttresses absorb outward forces so the walls can be thinner, allowing for lofty stained glass windows and thus more light. In many religions, light is associated with the divine, so churches wanted as much light as possible. For example, take a look at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which is nearly entirely stained glass.
Next, we have the horseshoe arch, also known as the keyhole arch, Moorish arch, or Islamic arch. Functionally, it's similar to a Roman arch, but its curve stretches beyond a half circle, creating a distinctive horseshoe shape. It first appears around 300 CE in pre-Islamic Syria, but it was largely adopted by the Spanish Visigoths, the guys who sacked Rome, who then spread it throughout the entire Islamic Empire. Generally, when you see a horseshoe arch, you know you're looking at a place with a history of Islamic culture.
With these 3 arches alone, you can identify a complex history of conquest, destruction, and reconstruction throughout much of Europe and the Middle East. Just look at Toledo in Spain. On the Alcantara Bridge, we can see multiple styles of arches when entering the city. The bridge itself was built by the Roman Empire, possibly around the 3rd century, and it uses a rounded arch to span the river. The defensive towers were built and rebuilt as the city changed hands through the phases of occupation, Roman, Christian, Visigoth, with layers of arches one after another. The architecture shares the space nicely, even when the peoples could not.
Finally, we have the catenary arch. It follows the shape of a naturally hanging chain, but inverted. A hanging rope is under tension, pulling on itself as it hangs. When inverted, those tension forces are converted to compression forces. In fact, entire buildings have been designed by creating an inverted string model, which lets gravity naturally calculate the curves before they are flipped and rendered in stone.
A catenary arch is very similar to a parabolic arch. Some people use them interchangeably, despite small differences in their curve. You can see it in older examples like the Takastra, or more recently in the Sagrada Familia or the St. Louis Arch.
Hey, why can't the Sagrada Familia and the Arc de Triomphe be friends?
I don't know. Why?
Because they're arch enemies. Thanks for watching.
Keep looking up.
Okay. So one more thing. Alright, here we go. Which one?
Priceline can save you up to 60% on top hotels.
The back in the Ile d'Orléans of one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the world, Notre Dame in Paris. When it was built in the 12th century, it was planned to be the tallest building of the day, which posed quite a challenge for the medieval builders. But they came up with a remarkable solution to their problem. It's called the flying buttress.
Joining us now in an effort for worldwide comprehension of the world of science is Bob Fournier. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Ralph.
Paris, France, huh?
Oh, it's wonderful, Ralph. Beautiful day here.
Yeah, well, you know how it is, Paris in the spring. All right, now tell me something. Notre Dame was planned as what, the tallest building of its day?
That's right, in the 12th century. By the end of the 12th century, it was the tallest building in Europe. And it was superseded shortly thereafter by other cathedrals, but it was really at the forefront of a revolution. It changed the way we built buildings, and particularly cathedrals. And even today, it's just magnificent, as you can see behind me.
What kind of technical problems did they have in figuring out how to build that specific church?
Well, Notre Dame is what's called Gothic architecture, and what that really means is that the architects made a huge departure. Rather than building buildings that were made out of big, big rocks piled one on top of each other, what they did is they went very high, but they also made the walls very thin. And that was to bring more glass into the walls, to make them more elegant. But the problem there is that suddenly these buildings were subject to wind. That is, you have to recognize that when you've got a building that's almost 200 feet high, then suddenly the wind blows, it begins to rotate or flex. That was a major problem, and that's one which they actually overcame with the building of Notre Dame.
Now, how did they come up with the solution, the flying buttress?
Well, Ralph, no one's really quite certain, and actually scientists haven't been sure for a very long time that the flying buttress is anything more than an ornament. But recently there was a study done that looked at the cathedrals and tried to understand what the role of the flying buttress was. And the way they did this, they did it in the laboratory. They took a piece of plastic and shaped it to the shape of the cathedral, and they put weights on it to mimic the force of the wind or the force of gravity. And then this plastic would gradually distort. When it did, they could see the forces that were involved. And what they came up with was to say that the flying buttress is absolutely essential to the well-being of the building, and it just seemed to come out of the blue. We don't understand originally where it came from.
But you know, the funny thing is, we have all these models we can use now, and there's scientists with the lasers and everything else, but they didn't have any of that. They just went by luck. I mean, how did they figure this out? What did they do?
Well, Ralph, that really is the big question, and that's the one that people would like to understand. I mean, the obvious thing is that they looked around them and drew from their environment some kind of inspiration. And one suggestion, I don't know how true this is, one suggestion is that they used the human skull. Because if you use the human skull, it covers a lot of interior volume. It's very, very strong. It has arches on the side called zygomatic arches, and in some ways, it mimics a cathedral. So maybe they looked at the human skull and said, perhaps we can build buildings somewhat differently if we model it on something around us which nature has evolved. So whether that's true or not remains to be seen, but all you have to do is go inside one of these cathedrals, Ralph, and look upwards and see the open space in the windows, and you suddenly realize it's absolutely mind-boggling.
Well, they don't send me to Paris, Bob. They send you.
Sorry,
I'm bitter about this. All right, 800 years though. I mean, was this the kind of building they really did plan to have stand for 800 years, or is that just a fluke?
Well, I guess that's a very difficult question to ask. But what scientists have said is probably what they did was to build on experience. That is, it's been suggested that architects of the 12th century couldn't read or write, probably couldn't multiply. So how could they project in the future something that would last 800 or 900 years? Well, the answer is they probably couldn't. But what we think they did is they built buildings bit by bit. And as they built them, they watched them very carefully. That is, they looked at the mortar between the rocks to see if it was beginning to crack after a big windstorm. Or they would wait for some big event and then scurry all over the building to see if there's any sign. The thing you have to remember about Notre Dame is that it was built, took 100 years to build. So they had a lot of time to look at it. In addition to that, it was rebuilt in the 13th century. So I think they did it by trial and error. And in the end, the fact that it's lasted 800 years is a clear sign that they did it right, bit by bit, empirically.
It's funny because it sounds very much like any other kind of scientist would approve of this, that you have the idea of a hypothesis, you try it out, and then you learn from it.
You're exactly correct, Ralph. I think...
All right, that's fine. Now, does everybody know that Notre Dame caught on fire last year? All right, it's going to take... Well, the stone is there, but the other stuff that wasn't stone, the roof and everything, is gone. They have to, though. Sometimes if you expose stone and mortar to a lot of heat, also that's going to cause structural damage. So I haven't seen an estimate. Does anybody know an estimate how long they think it's going to take to rebuild that? First of all, they had to look at it carefully, see what was the damage and that kind of thing there, and then they had to come up with the money, and then they had to say what's the plan, who's going to rebuild it. But they are rebuilding right now. They are currently rebuilding this. So.
Do they know what caused it?
Did anybody remember?
What was the question?
The Notre Dame fire. You know what? I need to look that up because it happened over a year ago, and it was all over the news. It's just that I don't remember them saying anything was that person did it. Let me get here. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do, and I'll show you one more before we leave today. Here's what you should have already read by now, and it talks about this right here is called a cantilever. And again, if you don't have your book with you, I made sure the last 2 or 3 years that everybody wrote that word in there because he shows a cantilever, but he never writes it down here. But I'll show you what a cantilever is in another video in just a minute. But here's a beam that is being supported only in one end, so it sticks out. And we actually have a lot of different cantilevers in nature, and we also have cantilevers in architecture. I've seen people, they call them floating shelves. You put a shelf on the wall, but there's no brackets to hold it up. You ever seen those? I've seen floating stairways. Have you ever seen that? Steps, like steps that go up a side of a wall, but there's nothing underneath them. Have you ever seen that? So anyway, cantilevers are really big in architecture, and I'll show you some in just a minute. But here's what happens. When you put a weight on a cantilever, then this part of the cantilever tends to stretch. So if it was a material that could handle the stretch, then you'd be all right. And then down here you have compression. And then what do they call this layer right here? What do they call the zone where it seems to be almost no compression, no tension. Okay, you haven't read this. Okay, and they call this the neutral layer. It's right there, neutral layer. Now, what if we take that same bar and we don't act like a cantilever? We just act like it's a bar that we're going to put weight on it. Now, where is the stretching taking place? Take a look up there. Can you see the arrows? So in this case, stretching is taking place down here and compression right here. Neither one of those is great for materials. Some materials like concrete, it just would not handle it very well at all. Steel's pretty good. Steel's pretty good at doing this. But they found out that what they could do is they could make a bar of steel that was like this and really long, and it would be incredibly heavy. It would also cost a lot of money, and it would be very strong. You could do that. But then they found out, I don't know who first did this, they decided that, hey, we figured out that most of the stretching and compressing are taking place at the top and the bottom. Why don't we put something where we keep a lot of steel there, because there's a lot of stresses going on, but we don't really need that much steel in this area here, so let's get rid of it. And this is called an I-beam, because it's looked like, see the cross section's like a capital letter I? And now you'll always see I-beams used in construction right now. If I were going to build an airplane, I'd build an I-beam out of aluminum, but I'd also even cut extra pieces of weight there, because for airplanes, weight is something you want to get rid of. You want strength, but with the least amount of weight you can have. Okay, you ever seen I-beams, haven't you? Okay, they're called I-beams. They have a question down here. It's kind of a simple question. If I were going to build something on a tree limb, and I knew I was going to hang a weight on it, where would I drill the hole? Would I drill it here, here, or here? If I knew I had to drill a hole through a limb, and I knew it was going to have heavy weights or stresses on it, where would I put that? Who wants to try it? Where would you drill a hole? What do you think? Yes?
In the middle.
Okay, that's right. Because if you do it here, if you put weights here, what's going to happen? There's going to be a lot of stresses on the top and the bottom, aren't there? And that's going to tend to either crush through, either stretch it. If it stretches here, it'll open up, or crush through here. So you put it in the middle. All right. And so I'll show you one of those in the video. And the next page, if you read this, if you ever want to play a word game, and you know those games are sometimes like Hangman or anything like that, you don't people, you know they're going to catch it, use this word right here. Because even though it was about 20 years ago I first saw that word, I had never heard of it in my life. And it's called a catenary. And a catenary, engineers, believe it or not, engineers will take materials like a chain or a rope, and they'll hang it. They'll let it hang on its own weight. And all the tension forces and things will make its own shape. And it's a catenary shape. Now, if you were to reverse that catenary shape, you would make a really strong arch. And that's why this person is in San Francisco. Does everybody know this is St. Louis? If you go to St. Louis, that's the St. Louis Arch. Have you seen that before? Okay. And this happens to be a catenary arch, and that's why this is symmetric to that right there. See that? So there's the catenary. Now, let me show you. I don't know how much, it's not engineering class, it's not architecture class, but let me show you something I think you'll enjoy. Let's see. Oh, I spelled it right. I spelled it wrong. Oops. Can't. Which one did I see today? Here it is. Okay. Let's look at some homes that are cantilevered. And here's one. Mandalorian. Okay. Okay, so look at this house right here. Now, you understand what's going on here? There's nothing, there's no wall here. There's no wall here to support all that weight. So how is all that weight being supported? Yes?
Will they have an I-beam that goes from the end of
It may be an I-beam, we could use wood, but in this case, they have to have something back here that's really supporting this, because you have all this overhanging weight, and that's what a cantilever is. And so architects, if they do it right, they can actually make some pretty neat houses. Let's skip through some of these. That one? What's that right here? Hey, what's that? Now I'm going to show you the most famous. Mr. Stewart's not here anymore. But he used to have this poster in his room. Whoa. Here it is. This is probably America's most famous architect. Do you know who this is?
Department store, an iconic building and department store chain that existed for over a century.
Wait, did I pick the right one?
Well, the Kaufman.
No. Does anybody know who built this building?
But it was built in 1935.
1935. It's called Falling Water. Does anybody know who built it?
Frank Lloyd.
Yes, Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright. The last name is Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, probably America's most famous architect. He wanted to build a building that was over this waterfall, and he didn't want legs or walls that go down into the waterfall.
We're going to take a 1-hour tour of this stunning masterpiece.
It's in Pennsylvania. If you ever go to Pennsylvania, you can look up Frank Lloyd Wright, Falling Water.
There's only one supported beam. It's called the cantilever design. Blended South American
Come on, let's see some more.
in Asian art. When he created this piece, he'd just come back from Japan. So there's a lot of Japanese. And then stonework.
This is all cantilevered.
So this is the walkway leading out to Falling Water. How was it, Mike?
Amazing. This needs to be listed by UNESCO.
So here you can see the exterior of the house. You can hear the falling water. And this is a National Historic Landmark. It's protected by the Pennsylvania Conservancy. So Falling Water was built in 1955 by Frank Wright, who was 67 when he built this. During this time period, they didn't really have plumbing water in a lot of the homes here. So this one does. And there's also recessed lighting and a lot of other inventions, including a carport. Frank Lloyd Wright's design was daring and ahead of its time, with its striking integration into the natural surroundings. Can you guess what the final cost of this home was in 1935? The original cost of the home was $155,000, and adjusted for inflation, today it would be equivalent to $2.7 million. We hope that you enjoyed this look into the masterpiece of Falling.
Okay. All right. So what we have is architecture having to do with physics. And like the one article you saw, I don't think they actually had people that were physicists, but there was a lot of trial and error. And kind of like, let's try this, let's see what happens. Hey, it works pretty well. And these, one thing about arches, which I thought they might do a little bit more on, is, oops, sorry. If they, when you build an arch like this, and you have this keystone here, like that, it does transfer the forces down to each block. But when it gets down to the, so when it gets down to here, see what's happening down here, it does transfer the weight down to here, but it also has another vector that tends to push out. So the problem with arches is that when they get to the bottom, the weight, it also tends to want to push itself out. There are some really big cathedrals in Europe that they're having that problem right now. Even though they've been up there over 500 years, slowly, as the forces are actually pushing the bottoms out. Now what happens? If these bottoms get pushed out too much, then the whole thing's going to collapse. And so it's a huge mega engineering project to try to figure out how to save some of these buildings. They didn't know enough engineering back then to do that. So right here, what they had figured out a long time ago was you could put buttresses here, you could put some heavy weights here, and maybe even attach them into the ground, and then that would tend to push back. You see that? That's one thing you could do. What Notre Dame did, because it was so high, this wasn't going to work. So they ended up having these flying buttresses. See how that? And so they actually pushed from the ground up like that. And that's what those things are called, flying buttresses there. All right. Have you guys, I just want to make sure if you're not reading this at all, if you've already read it, then today actually made a little more sense to you, all right? I have the last thing I'd like to start today, and then tomorrow I'll probably wrap it up, finish, review. I'll even help you answer some of your homework questions, all right? We should be able to do that. And there are mini tests on Wednesday. All right, did I give you one of these? Is this in your packet? Can you check your packet? I think I did. Is it on one of the pages? Okay. All right, what I'd like to do, you will not quite understand all of this today, and even though I'm just kind of introducing it today, but I will spend some time with this tomorrow, and it's one of my favorite things to teach in this chapter. It's the last 3 pages, and does anybody know what famous scientist person was the first person to actually investigate this? And it was a real thing. Nobody knew about it before, but find it for you. I had had a pretty neat student quite a few years ago. I'll show you her paper right here. Anybody know that person? Okay. Anyway, this student, many years ago, they actually did enough research where they actually found some original text, and this is from Galileo. And when you look in here, it talks about, and this is actually original text, she just typed it, and here's an actual picture there. Notice they're showing a cantilever here, see that? So he talked about all kinds of forces that were involved in buildings and things, and then he got into something like this. It's like, what's that about? Big bone, little bone, what's that? What is that all about? Why would Galileo want to get into something like that? And so he did talk about cantilevers. He talked about bones. He talked about stresses and things like that. He talked about what happens if you try to do that. And so that's a long time ago, 1600s, right? They're talking about a long time ago. And the word they use today is called scaling. Now, you guys are very smart, and again, I'm only going to introduce it to you today a little bit today, all right? But what I'd like to do is we start out with the simplest structure we can look at, and here's a cube. Here's the simplest three-dimensional structure we can look at, a cube. And then we'll get to the sphere. Then we'll go to the sphere and do that next. But you're going to find out the lessons you learned on the cube are the same lessons you're going to find out here. And Galileo figured that out. All right, here it is. When I first was reading this many years ago, it was a little bit sad because I always liked even science fiction movies, especially the bad ones. Some of the, I just saw one a week ago. I hadn't seen that for a long time. It was a black and white one called Them, and it was about ants, giant ants in New Mexico. Of course, that's where some of the first atomic testing took place. And and they had evidence about radiation mutating things, and so therefore big ants and mutation, all that kind of stuff. There was a whole genre of films. The 50-Foot Colossal Woman. There was all kind. The Fly, the first original The Fly. There's all kinds of movies that went around with radiation causing mutation. The Hulk in the comic books, that came the idea too. All right, so let me tell you what's going on here. What they're saying, and Galileo would have agreed to it, is if you took something like a chimpanzee and you made him the size of King Kong, would he wreak havoc among cities? And Galileo would agree, and physicists today would agree, no, King Kong couldn't even stand up. King Kong, his legs would be broken, he'd be laying on the ground, he can't have it. Could we have a 10-foot ant? No, it can't happen. It couldn't even walk. It wouldn't even be able to support its own weight. Now, what does that mean? What we see here is Galileo figured out whether it's a piece of wood or a piece of bone. He said, where does the strength come from? And he said that the strength of materials comes from their cross-sectional area. So if I had a beam like this, the cross-sectional area would have to do with how strong it would be. And if it was a bone, the same thing. They showed a little bone, a big bone like that. But where does the weight of the object come from? This is cross-sectional area. Notice that was in 2 dimensions, okay? And where does the weight come from? The weight is found in the volume, isn't it? The volume of that piece of steel or that piece of wood, that's where all the weight is, isn't it? And so something kind of weird happens when you look at 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensional things when they get scaled up. All right, let's try a cube. Ready? The first cube. What is the 1-dimensional length? What is the 1-dimensional length of this cube? Oh, I have to go. All right, we'll do it tomorrow. Would you read about scaling? I put a, yes. I did put a video on Google Classroom for you to watch. It's about arches, if you want to watch one more about arches. All right, see you tomorrow.